I still remember the morning the dive boat cut through the glassy waters off the coast of southern Greece. The sun just beginning to warm the limestone cliffs that rose above us, like ancient sentinels watching over a secret they had kept for 5,000 years. We were searching for Pavlopetri, a Bronze Age harbour city that had slipped beneath the waves in an age before recorded history, its streets and buildings preserved in the shallow turquoise depths of the Mediterranean, like a memory the sea had chosen not to erase. I had read about this place in academic journals and archaeological reports, had studied the sonar maps and the excavation plans, had thought I understood what we were looking for. But understanding a place on paper and witnessing it with your own eyes are separated by a distance as vast as the one between the surface and the seafloor. And I was about to cross that distance in a way that would change how I thought about time, about memory, about the relationship between human ambition and the patient indifference of the sea. The water that morning was impossibly clear, a shade of turquoise that seemed to glow from within, as if the Mediterranean itself were offering us a gift of visibility. I remember the moment my fins broke the surface, the shock of cool water against my skin, the weight of my equipment settling into familiar places on my body. The dive master, a local man named Stavros, whose family had fished these waters for generations, had pointed toward a patch of sea that looked no different from any other, had said simply, "There, beneath us, the old city." His voice carried no drama, no theatrical emphasis, just the matter-of-fact reverence of someone who had grown up, knowing that extraordinary things lay hidden in ordinary places, that the sea kept its secrets close and revealed them only to those who knew where to look. My first descent was slow, controlled, the way all meaningful descents should be. I finned through water so clear it felt like flying, like moving through air that had somehow learned to support my weight, like being granted a temporary exemption from the laws that normally govern human movement. At 15 meters, the outlines began to emerge from the sand below, gradual at first, then with increasing clarity as my eyes adjusted to the filtered light and the strange geometry of human construction against the organic randomness of the seafloor. Stone foundations, straight lines where nature would have made curves, pathways that connected spaces with the deliberate intention of a community that had needed to move from place to place with purpose. The ghostly grid of a town began to resolve itself, and I felt something shift in my chest, a sensation that was part recognition and part disbelief, the feeling you get when you encounter something that your mind knows is real, but your heart insists must be impossible. I ran my gloved hand along a threshold that someone had crossed in the time before recorded history, feeling the weight of all the mornings that had dawned over this place when it still breathed with human life. The stone was worn smooth not by water but by feet, by the passage of bodies that had carried burdens and children and hopes through this doorway thousands of years before the concept of history had been invented. I tried to imagine the person who had last crossed this threshold, the final morning when this city had still been a city and not an archaeological site, when the sea had been a source of livelihood rather than a force of erasure. Had they known? Had there been warnings, signs that the water was rising, that the harbour they had built to welcome the world was about to become the instrument of their disappearance? Or had it happened gradually, a slow surrender that no single generation could fully perceive, each person accepting a slightly wetter world than the one their parents had known until the wetness became the world itself? The silence underwater was profound, broken only by the rhythmic sound of my own breathing, the mechanical inhale and exhale that reminded me I was a visitor in a place that had once sustained human life without any need for technology. I found myself imagining the voices that had once echoed through these streets, the laughter of children playing in courtyards that were now home to fish and seagrass, the bargaining of traders who had brought goods from across the Mediterranean to this harbour that had once been a crossroads of civilizations, the prayers offered to gods whose names we barely remember, whose temples had crumbled and whose worshippers had become dust and memory. The sound of my breathing became a kind of meditation, a reminder that I was alive in a place where life had continued in forms that the original inhabitants could never have imagined, that the sea had not destroyed this city so much as transformed it, had made it part of a different kind of community that operated on different principles, but was no less real for its strangeness. Pavlopetri is not a ruin in the traditional sense. It is a city suspended in time, its layout so intact that archaeologists have mapped entire neighborhoods, complete with courtyards and tombs, and what appears to be a central plaza, where the community gathered to conduct the business of being human together. I hovered above what had once been a street, looking down at the stone surface worn smooth by millennia of feet, and felt the strange sensation of being both observer and participant in a story that spans the entirety of human civilization. The street led to a building that might have been a storehouse, its walls still standing to waist height, its interior filled with sand that had preserved rather than destroyed. I could see where shelves had once been mounted, where goods had been displayed, where transactions had occurred that had connected this small harbour to a network of trade that stretched from Egypt to the Black Sea, from the Levant to the Greek islands. I swam through what had been a courtyard, finning carefully to avoid disturbing the sediment that had accumulated over centuries of quiet accumulation. A well stood in the centre, its stone lining still visible, its depth now filled with seawater that was clearer than any water that had ever been drawn from it for drinking. I looked down into that well and saw my own reflection looking back at me, distorted by the movement of the water, a face that was both mine and not mine, a person who existed in a moment that this well had been waiting thousands of years to witness. The symbolism was not lost on me, though I resisted the urge to interpret it, to turn this experience into a metaphor, rather than allowing it to remain what it was. A moment of connection across time, a recognition that the human need for water, for community, for places to gather and work and love, has not changed in any essential way since this city had been young. The tombs were the most haunting part of the city, as tombs always are. They lay on the outskirts of the settlement, arranged with the same care that the living had shown in arranging their streets and their buildings, as if death were merely another neighborhood in a city that had room for everyone. The stone sarcophagi were empty now, their contents long since dissolved or scattered by the movement of water through the porous rock, but their shapes remained, their forms still speaking of the respect that the living had shown for the dead, the hope that something of the person survived beyond the dissolution of the body. I floated above one of these tombs, looking down at the lid that had been carved with patterns I could not decipher, symbols that might have been names or prayers, or simply decorative flourishes meant to honor the person who rested within, and I felt the weight of all the grief that had been expressed in this place, all the love that had outlasted memory and become part of the stone itself. Stavros had told me before the dive that his grandmother spoke of lights beneath the water on certain nights, a glow that moved through the streets of the old city, like the spirits of the people who had once lived there, still going about their business in a world that had forgotten them. I had smiled politely, filing the story under the category of local folklore, the kind of narrative that grows up around ancient places like moss growing on old stone. But floating above the central plaza, looking down at the space where a community had gathered to make decisions and celebrate festivals and argue about the things that communities always argue about, I understood why his grandmother had seen lights. The water itself seemed to glow in certain angles of sunlight, refracting and reflecting in ways that created patterns of light and shadow on the seafloor, movements that could easily be interpreted as the passage of invisible beings through streets that still existed in some dimension beyond ordinary perception. I did not believe in ghosts, but I believed in the persistence of place, in the way that human intention could imprint itself on stone and water and survive the erosion of centuries. I spent 3 hours in that city, surfacing only when my air supply demanded it, returning again and again to places that had drawn me with an inexplicable gravity. Each dive revealed new details, new connections between spaces that I had not seen before, new evidence of the complexity of life that had been lived here. A storage room with amphorae still arranged in neat rows, their contents long since it's dissolved, but their shapes speaking of the trade in olive oil and wine that had sustained this harbor's economy. A workshop with tools still visible in the sediment, the implements of craftspeople who had made things with their hands and sold them to neighbors who valued their skill. A house with a hearth that still retained the blackening of ancient fires, the center of a family that had cooked and eaten and told stories in the warmth of flames that had gone out thousands of years before I was born. The Mediterranean has swallowed countless cities, has been the agent of erasure for civilizations that rose and fell and left behind only fragments for us to puzzle over. But few have been preserved with such heartbreaking completeness, few offer such an intimate connection to the people who built them and loved them, and eventually surrendered them to the rising sea. Pavlopetri is not a monument to human failure, not a cautionary tale about the fragility of civilization in the face of natural forces. It is a testament to human persistence, to the way that communities create meaning in places that the world does not guarantee will last, to the courage of building something permanent in a world that operates on principles of change and dissolution. The people who lived here knew, as all people know at some level, that their city would not last forever. They built it anyway, they loved it anyway, they crossed thresholds and drew water from wells and buried their dead with honor, creating a life that was complete in itself, that did not require eternity to justify its existence. When I finally surfaced for the last time that day, the sun was setting behind the limestone cliffs. painting the water in shades of gold and amber that made the Mediterranean look like a liquid jewel. Stavros helped me from the water, his hands rough with decades of handling ropes and nets, and he looked at me with eyes that seemed to know what I had seen, what I had felt, what I would carry with me from this place into the rest of my life. He did not ask. He simply nodded, as if confirming something we both understood, and handed me a towel that smelled of salt and sun, and the particular comfort of human care in a world that often seems indifferent to our needs. I have returned to Pavlopetri twice since that first dive, each time finding new details, new connections, new reasons to marvel at the persistence of human intention in the face of time's erosion. I have seen the city in different seasons, under different conditions of light and water clarity, and each visit has revealed aspects that the previous ones had hidden. But nothing has matched that first morning, that first descent, that first moment when the grid of streets emerged from the sand and I understood, with a clarity that still makes me catch my breath, that I was not merely visiting an archaeological site. I was visiting a home. Not my home, not a home that I could claim any connection to through blood or heritage or shared tradition, but a home nonetheless, a place where human beings had done the things that human beings do, had loved and worked and grieved and hoped, had created a world that was meaningful to them, and that remains meaningful to anyone who takes the time to witness it. The sea rises. The sea falls. Cities are built and cities are lost. But something persists, something that is not merely stone or memory but a kind of resonance, a vibration that continues in the water and the light and the silence that surrounds places where human life once flourished. Pavlopetri taught me that the past is not past, that it exists in a continuous present that we can access if we are willing to descend, to look, to listen with more than our ears. The city waits beneath the waves, patient beyond human comprehension, for the next witness brave enough to fin through its streets and feel the weight of all the mornings that have dawned over this place, all the lives that have been lived and lost and transformed into something that the sea has chosen to preserve rather than destroy. I am merely a witness, but what a witness I have been. I will never forget the moment our sonar first detected the massive stone blocks scattered across the seafloor near Alexandria, Egypt. Their arrangement too deliberate to be natural, their scale too ambitious to be anything but the work of a civilization that believed itself eternal. We were searching for Heraklion, the legendary port city, that had served as the gateway to Egypt for Greek and Roman traders before it vanished beneath the Mediterranean sometime in the 8th century AD, and I had spent 3 years preparing for this expedition, poring over ancient texts and modern surveys, convincing myself that I was pursuing science rather than chasing a ghost. The research vessel, Thonis, had been my home for 6 weeks, a floating laboratory staffed with archaeologists and geophysicists and divers who spoke of the lost city with a mixture of professional skepticism and barely concealed longing. I was the expedition's underwater archaeologist, a title that sounds more adventurous than it is. Most of my work involving the careful documentation of fragments, the patient reconstruction of stories from scattered evidence. But on that morning, as the sonar screen began to resolve shapes that no natural process could have created, I understood that some adventures begin not with action, but with recognition, with the slow dawning realization that the world has been keeping a secret and has finally decided to share it. The descent through the coastal waters of Abu Qir Bay was disorienting at first, the murk of river sediment and agricultural runoff creating a visibility that extended barely an arm's length in any direction. I followed my dive partner, an Egyptian marine archaeologist named Amira Fayed, whose knowledge of these waters was as deep as the history they concealed, finning through brown-green water that felt more like swimming through soup than through the Mediterranean I had imagined. We were at 20 meters, then 30, the light fading as the sediment absorbed what little sunshine filtered through the surface. I remember thinking that this was how cities were lost, not in dramatic moments of catastrophe, but in gradual accumulations of obscurity, the world above slowly forgetting what lay beneath until the forgetting became complete. And then, at 32 meters, the water changed, the sediment thinned, the visibility opened, and suddenly I was swimming through a clarity that seemed almost supernatural, as if the sea itself had decided to part its curtains and reveal what it had been hiding. The shapes resolved gradually, the way dreams resolve upon waking, details emerging from vagueness with a slowness that made each revelation feel earned. Columns first, massive granite cylinders that had once supported roofs and ambitions, now standing like sentinels in a landscape that had become alien to the purposes for which they were built. Then statues, torsos and heads and fragments of limbs, some still bearing the polished surfaces that craftsmen had spent months achieving, others covered in the accretions of centuries, transformed by the patient chemistry of seawater into something that was both more and less than what their creators had intended. Temple foundations appeared, their outlines visible in the sand, the geometry of sacred spaces still discernible beneath the sediment that had accumulated like a blanket drawn over a sleeping child. And finally, the harbor itself, the reason this city had existed, the interface between land and sea that had made Heraklion one of the busiest ports in the ancient world. I swam between two massive granite pillars that had once supported a temple to Amun-Gerib, their surfaces still bearing hieroglyphic inscriptions that had been intended to last forever, carved with the confidence of a people who believed that their gods would protect what their hands had built. The hieroglyphs were worn but legible, the cartouches of pharaohs who had ruled when the world was younger, the prayers and dedications that had been offered in the hope of divine favor. I ran my gloved hand along the carved surface, feeling the grooves that chisels had made in stone quarried hundreds of miles away and transported here by barges and human effort, and I felt the peculiar vertigo that comes from touching something that was already ancient when the first European explorers set sail for the New World. These pillars had stood for 2,000 years before Columbus crossed the Atlantic. They had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the transformation of religions, the slow accumulation of human knowledge that had eventually led to my presence here, finning through their shadows with a tank of compressed air and a sense of wonder that no amount of professional training could have prepared me for. Amira signaled that she was moving toward the harbor area, and I followed, my eyes adjusting to the scale of what we were witnessing. The temple was impressive, but the harbor was where the life of this city had pulsed, where the commerce and the community and the daily routines of existence had unfolded in patterns that connected this place to the wider world. The remains of wooden piers had rotted away centuries ago, consumed by marine organisms that found in human construction the same nutrients they found in fallen trees, but their stone foundations remained, arranged in regular patterns that spoke of deliberate planning, of engineers who had understood tides and currents, and the needs of vessels that ranged from small fishing boats to massive cargo ships. I hovered above one of these foundations, looking down at the holes where wooden posts had once been set, and tried to imagine the pier as it had been, the planks that had connected ship to shore, the hands that had loaded and unloaded the goods that made this city wealthy and important, and eventually worth remembering. The most haunting discovery was not the grandeur of the temples but the small things, the objects that spoke of individual lives rather than collective ambition. A collection of anchors still resting where ships had moored, their iron flukes buried in sediment, their wooden stocks long since dissolved, but their shape still recognizable to anyone who had studied maritime history. Storage jars, amphorae, half buried in the sediment with their necks pointing toward the surface, like flowers growing in an impossible garden, their contents of grain and wine and olive oil long since dispersed into the water, but their forms still speaking of the trade that had connected this harbor to Crete and Cyprus and the distant shores of the Black Sea. I found a small oil lamp, its terracotta body intact, its wick hole still visible, and I held it in my gloved hand for a long moment, thinking about the person who had lit this lamp, who had needed light in a world without electricity, who had probably been a sailor or a dock worker, or someone else whose name would never appear in the historical record, but whose need for light was as real and as human as my own need for air. Amira found the coins. She was documenting a section of the harbor floor, her camera clicking with the muffled sound that underwater photography makes when she signaled for me to join her. There, scattered across an area no larger than a dining table, were dozens of coins from different eras and different empires, a numismatic catalogue of the city's history that no museum could have assembled with such completeness. Greek drachmas from the Ptolemaic period, Roman denarii from the time of Augustus, Byzantine coins from the centuries just before the city's disappearance, each one bearing the profile of a ruler who had claimed dominion over this place without ever imagining that the sea would have the final word. I picked one up, a silver tetradrachm with the face of Ptolemy II, and felt the weight of it in my palm, the physical reality of an object that had passed through human hands in a transaction that was as ordinary as buying bread or paying a fare, and I understood that history is not made by the people whose faces appear on coins. History is made by the people who used the coins, who carried them in pouches and spent them on necessities and saved them for futures that never arrived. The statues were what the world would remember, what the documentaries would feature, what the museum exhibitions would reconstruct with dramatic lighting and explanatory placards. We found a colossal figure of a pharaoh, probably one of the Ptolemies who had ruled Egypt as Greek kings, his granite body still imposing despite the loss of his arms and the damage to his face. We found a smaller figure of Isis, the goddess who had protected sailors, and who had, apparently, failed to protect this city from the sea that had been her domain. We found fragments of sphinxes and obelisks, and the kind of monumental architecture that ancient civilizations used to announce their importance to the world, and perhaps to themselves. But I kept returning to the small things, to the lamp and the coins and the storage jars, because these were the objects that connected me to the people who had lived here, that made the abstraction of history into something I could touch and hold, and almost understand. I thought about the sailors who had tied their vessels here, the men and women whose lives had been defined by the movement of goods across the Mediterranean, who had known this harbour as a place of safety, in a world where the sea was as dangerous as it was necessary. I thought about the cargoes of grain and wine and incense that had passed through this harbour, the products of Egyptian agriculture and Greek craftsmanship and Arabian trade, that had connected 3 continents in an economic network, that had made this city wealthy and eventually made it worth the effort of losing. I thought about the prayers offered for safe passage across a sea that eventually claimed the city itself, the rituals performed at the temple of Amun-Gereb, the offerings made to gods whose names we still remember but whose powers we no longer believe in. The sea had heard those prayers, had accepted those offerings, and had taken the city anyway, not out of malice but out of the patient indifference that is the true nature of natural forces, the willingness to wait for centuries if necessary, the certainty that what is borrowed will eventually be returned. Heraklion did not fall to war or conquest. It simply sank, gradually, as the land beneath it subsided, and the Mediterranean rose to reclaim what had been borrowed from it. The process took centuries, probably, each generation accepting a slightly wetter world than the one before, each builder raising foundations a little higher, each sailor adjusting to channels that were slowly becoming deeper and more treacherous. There was no single moment of catastrophe, no dramatic event that could be recorded and remembered, just the slow accumulation of water where land had been, the gradual transformation of streets into canals and canals into harbours, and harbours into the seafloor where I was now swimming. The city had not been destroyed. It had been absorbed, incorporated into the marine ecosystem that had always surrounded it, transformed from a human place into a place where humans could visit, but not remain, swimming through its streets. I understood that the sea is patient in ways that civilizations are not, that it measures time in geological units that make human history seem like a brief flicker, a momentary disturbance in the long calm of its existence. The sea had waited for this city to be built, had watched it rise and flourish and decline, and had eventually taken it back with the same lack of urgency that it applied to every other transformation in its long history. The sea never forgets what it is owed. The land that had been reclaimed from it, the harbours that had been carved from its margins, the boundaries that had been drawn and redrawn in the hope of controlling what cannot be controlled. All of it would eventually return to the water. All of it would become part of the seafloor, where future divers would swim and wonder, and try to imagine the lives that had been lived in places that no longer existed. I surfaced eventually, my air supply demanding the return to a world where I could breathe without technology, where gravity pulled me down rather than buoyancy pushing me up. Amira was already on the dive platform, her equipment being checked by the support team, her face showing the same mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration that I felt in my own body. We did not speak immediately. There were no words for what we had seen, no language that could convey the weight of standing in a place that had been built by people who believed in eternity, and had been claimed by a force that measured eternity in different units. We simply looked at each other, 2 people who had shared a witness, and nodded in the way that people do when they understand that some experiences transcend the possibility of description. That night, on the deck of the Thonis, I watched the stars emerge above the Mediterranean and thought about the city that lay beneath us, its streets still visible in the clear water, its statues still standing in the darkness, its small objects still waiting to be found by the next generation of divers who would come with better technology and more knowledge and the same hunger for witness that had brought me here. I thought about the child who had played with a toy in a house that was now 30 meters below the surface, the merchant who had counted coins in a warehouse that was now home to fish, the priest who had offered prayers in a temple whose pillars still stood, but whose roof had long since dissolved into the water that surrounded it. I thought about the patience of the sea, its willingness to wait, its certainty that everything returns to it eventually, and I understood that this was not a tragedy but a transformation, not a loss but a change in form. The city of Heraklion had been a place of human ambition, a statement of confidence in the permanence of civilization, the durability of stone, the protection of gods. It had become something else, a place where human ambition was visible but no longer operative, where stone endured but no longer supported, where gods were remembered but no longer invoked. And in that transformation, it had become a kind of gift, a message sent across the centuries to people who had not yet been born when the message was composed, a reminder that the sea is older than our civilizations and will outlast them, that the things we build are beautiful and important and temporary, that the patience of natural forces is the true measure of time in a world where human memory is brief and human ambition is vast. I am merely a witness. But what a witness I have been. The pillars of Heraklion still stand in the darkness, their hieroglyphs still speaking of eternity to an audience that knows better than to believe in such things, their granite surfaces still bearing the marks of hands that shaped them in a world that was younger and more confident than ours. I have touched those surfaces. I have read those inscriptions. I have swum through streets that were once walked by people whose names I will never know, but whose lives were as real and as complicated and as precious as my own. And I have understood, finally, that the sea does not destroy what we build. It simply waits for us to finish building, and then it makes what we have built part of itself, incorporating our ambition into its patience, our memory into its eternity, our small brief lives into the long story that it has been telling, since before the first human drew breath, and will continue telling long after the last human has returned to the water from which we all came. I remember the first time I saw the mosaic floors of Baiae gleaming through the green water of the Bay of Naples, their colors still vivid after 2,000 years of submersion, their patterns still capable of taking my breath away with a force that made me forget, for a moment, that I was 30 meters beneath the surface and breathing through a regulator that hissed with each inhalation like a mechanical reminder of my own fragility. I had come to this place as a marine archaeologist, a specialist in the preservation of submerged cultural heritage, but I approached it that morning as something closer to a pilgrim, carrying in my imagination all the histories I had read, all the images I had studied, all the expectations that 2 decades of academic preparation had constructed like a scaffold around an experience I could not yet imagine. Baiae had been the pleasure resort of the Roman elite, a place of thermal baths and villas and gardens that cascaded down hillsides to meet the Mediterranean with the confidence of a civilization that believed its pleasures would last as long as its empire. And when volcanic activity caused the land to sink beneath the waves in a geological event that must have seemed like the end of the world to those who witnessed it, it took with it an entire world of luxury and ambition and human vanity that now lay scattered across the seafloor like a dream that the sea had chosen to remember rather than erase. The dive boat that carried us from the harbour at Pozzuoli was small and weathered, the kind of vessel that has been maintained by fishermen who understand the sea better than any marine biologist and respect it more than any poet. Our captain, a man named Vincenzo, whose family had worked these waters for 4 generations, spoke of Baiae with the casual familiarity of someone who had grown up knowing that extraordinary things lay beneath the ordinary surface of his daily world. He pointed toward a patch of water that looked no different from any other, the green-blue expanse of the bay stretching to the horizon where Vesuvius stood against the sky like a warning that the earth beneath our feet was not as stable as we wished to believe. "There," he said, and the single word contained everything I needed to know about the relationship between human memory and the sea that eventually claims all memory. I checked my equipment with the methodical precision that diving demands, the ritual of tank and regulator and buoyancy compensator that transforms a human body into something that can survive briefly in a world where survival is not natural, and I rolled backward into water that was warm in a way that surprised me, warmer than the Mediterranean should be at this depth, carrying in its temperature the evidence of volcanic forces that still moved beneath the seafloor like a heartbeat that had been pulsing since before human beings existed to feel its warmth. The descent was gradual, a slow sinking through water that changed color as I went deeper, from the pale turquoise of the surface to a deeper green that seemed to glow from within, as if the bay itself were producing its own light. The visibility was extraordinary, a gift of the mineral content and the thermal currents that kept the water in constant motion, preventing the accumulation of sediment that obscures so many other submerged sites. At 15 meters, the first shapes began to emerge from the green haze, not suddenly but gradually, the way memories emerge when you are falling asleep, half-formed at first and then with increasing clarity. A wall of marble, its surface covered in the accretions of centuries, but still recognizable as the product of human hands, still bearing the polish that Roman craftsmen had achieved with abrasives and patience. A column base, the beginning of a structure that would resolve itself as I descended further. The corner of a mosaic, its geometric pattern visible even from a distance, its colors still speaking of the pigments that Roman artisans had mixed and applied with the confidence of a people who believed their work would endure. I finned through a corridor that had once connected a villa's dining room to its private harbor, the walls still bearing traces of frescoes that had depicted scenes from mythology, scenes of gods and heroes, and the kind of narrative art that Romans used to surround themselves with stories that explained their place in the world. The frescoes were faded now, their pigments dissolved by the chemistry of seawater, their images visible only as ghosts of color on plaster that had become as soft as wet paper. But I could see enough to understand what had been there, to recognize the style of the painting, to imagine the conversations that had echoed through this space when it was dry and lit by oil lamps and filled with the sounds of human sociability. The political deals that had been struck over cups of wine, the alliances formed and broken, the betrayals planned in rooms that now housed only fish, and the slow accumulation of sediment. Baiae had been a place of power as much as pleasure, a retreat where the emperors and senators of Rome had conducted the business of empire in surroundings, that advertised their wealth and their sophistication and their distance from the ordinary concerns of the people they ruled. I hovered in that corridor, looking at the faded frescoes and the marble walls and the empty doorways that had once led to rooms of entertainment and intrigue, and I felt the strange sensation of being present in a place where presence was no longer possible, of witnessing a world that had been designed for human bodies and was now accessible only to those who carried their own atmosphere with them, like visitors from another planet. The most remarkable feature of the site was the Nymphaeum, a semicircular chamber that had been designed to create the illusion of a natural grotto, its walls lined with niches that had once held statues of gods and nymphs, its ceiling engineered to filter light in patterns that suggested the dappled shade of a forest. I found it by following the corridor to its end, emerging into a space that opened before me with the dramatic intention of Roman theatrical architecture, a stage set for the performance of leisure and beauty. The statues were still there, standing in their niches like actors who had refused to leave the stage after the play had ended, their faces still serene, their poses still graceful, their marble bodies transformed by the water into something that seemed almost alive. A figure of Venus, her body draped in carved fabric that flowed like real cloth, her expression suggesting the kind of calm that comes from knowing you are beautiful and being observed. A nymph, her arms raised in a gesture that might have been dance or might have been supplication, her hair carved in waves that echoed the water that now surrounded her. A satyr, his face twisted in an expression of mischief that had survived 2,000 years of submersion without losing its vitality. They stood in permanent underwater twilight, their forms illuminated by the sunlight that filtered through the green water in shifting patterns, and they seemed to have accepted their transformation from garden ornaments to guardians of a submerged world with the same serenity that characterized their carved expressions. I touched the mosaic floor of what had been a private bath, the tiny tesserae still sharp beneath my gloved hand, their edges still capable of cutting, despite the centuries of water that had flowed over them. The pattern was geometric, a complex arrangement of interlocking shapes in black and white and red that created the illusion of three-dimensional space on a flat surface, a Roman technique that had been developed to impress visitors with the sophistication of their hosts. I ran my fingers across the surface, feeling the individual pieces, the mortar that held them in place, the slight irregularities that spoke of handwork rather than machine production, and I felt the weight of all the bodies that had relaxed in this water, all the ambitions that had been nurtured in this place of artificial paradise. Roman baths were not merely places of hygiene. They were social institutions, centers of community where people gathered to conduct business, to exchange gossip, to display their status through the quality of their surroundings and the exclusivity of their company. This bath had been private, attached to a villa that had belonged to someone wealthy enough to afford their own thermal complex, and the mosaic beneath my fingers had been designed to impress guests who were already impressed by everything else they had seen. I tried to imagine the temperature of the water when it had been heated by the same volcanic forces that now warmed the bay, the steam that would have risen from the surface, the sound of voices echoing in a space that was now filled with the silence of the deep and the occasional crackle of my own breathing. The garden was what affected me most deeply, though it was the most difficult to see. Roman gardens had been designed as extensions of the villa, outdoor rooms that combined cultivated nature with architectural elements to create spaces that were neither fully natural nor fully artificial. The remains of this garden were scattered across the seafloor, fragments of terracotta pots that had held plants, pieces of marble fountains that had once sent water cascading in decorative patterns, the outlines of planting beds that had been arranged with the same geometric precision as the mosaics inside. I found a statue of a young man, probably a representation of Apollo or some other god associated with beauty and youth, lying on its side where it had fallen when the land subsided, its face turned toward the sediment as if in sleep. I righted it carefully, feeling the weight of the marble, the smoothness of the carved surface, the detail of the hair and the eyes, and the muscles that some sculptor had spent months perfecting in the hope of achieving a likeness that would please a patron who had probably never bothered to learn the artist's name. The statue stood for a moment, balanced on the seafloor, and then slowly tilted back onto its side, the sediment too soft to support its weight, the water too dense to allow the kind of stability that stone requires on land. I left it there, understanding that my intervention was temporary, that the sea would arrange things according to its own logic, that the garden had become something else and could not be restored to what it had been. I thought about the people who had lived here, the owners of this villa and their guests and their servants, the network of human relationships that had made this place function. The owner had been wealthy, certainly, wealthy enough to afford marble imported from Carrara and mosaics created by master craftsmen and statues carved by artists whose names were probably recorded in documents that had long since dissolved. But wealth in Rome was precarious, dependent on imperial favor and political alliances, and the constant competition for status that defined elite life. The person who had relaxed in this bath, who had walked through this garden, who had entertained guests in rooms now filled with seawater, had probably spent as much time worrying about maintaining their position as enjoying the pleasures that their position afforded. The garden had been a refuge, but it had also been a statement, a declaration of wealth and taste and power that was as much about impressing others as about personal enjoyment. And in the end, all of it had been claimed by the same volcanic forces that had made the thermal baths possible, the same geological instability that had created the conditions for luxury and then destroyed the luxury it had created. I surfaced eventually, my air supply demanding the return to a world where I could breathe without technology, where the green light of the bay would be replaced by the ordinary light of the Italian afternoon. Vincenzo helped me onto the dive platform, his hands rough with decades of handling ropes and nets, and he looked at me with eyes that seemed to know what I had seen, what I had felt, what I would carry with me from this place into the rest of my life. He did not ask. He simply handed me a towel and a bottle of water, and I sat on the deck of the boat watching the bay settle into the calm of late afternoon, the water reflecting the sky in patterns that seemed almost as complex as the mosaics I had left below. By Aya is a meditation on impermanence, a reminder that even the most powerful civilizations eventually surrender their treasures to the sea, and that the Mediterranean, for all its beauty, has always been a collector of human dreams. I have returned to the site many times since that first dive, each visit revealing new details, new connections, new reasons to marvel at the persistence of human intention in the face of natural forces that operate on timescales beyond human comprehension. I have seen the mosaic floors in different conditions of light and water clarity, have watched the statues change appearance as the sediment shifts and the algae grows, and the slow processes of marine chemistry transform marble into something that is both more and less than what its creators intended. I have brought students here, have tried to convey to them what I felt that first morning, the weight of history and the fragility of memory, and the strange beauty of a place that exists in two worlds at once, the world of the surface and the world of the deep. The Nymphaeum still stands, its statues still serene, its architecture still capable of creating the illusion of a grotto, even in the reality of submersion. The bath still retains its mosaic floor, its tesserae still sharp, its patterns still speaking of a civilization that believed in the permanence of its achievements. The garden still holds its fragments, its statues, and its fountains and its planting beds, arranged in a configuration that suggests both randomness and design, both decay and the possibility of renewal. And I still descend into that green water, still fin through corridors that once echoed with human voices, still touch the surfaces that human hands created and the sea has preserved, and I still feel the same mixture of wonder and melancholy that I felt on that first morning. The same recognition that I am witnessing something that is both a loss and a gift, both an ending and a transformation. The Romans believed that the gods controlled the natural world, that volcanic eruptions and earthquakes and the slow subsidence of land were expressions of divine will rather than the operation of physical forces. We know better now, or we think we do. We understand plate tectonics and volcanic activity, and the geological processes that create and destroy landscapes on timescales that make human history seem like a brief flicker. But knowing the mechanism does not diminish the mystery, does not reduce the wonder of standing in a place that was built by people who believed their empire would last forever and was claimed by forces that operate on a timescale that makes empires seem as temporary as mayflies. The sea does not care about our explanations. The sea simply waits, patient beyond human comprehension, For the moment when the land becomes ready to return to the water from which it emerged, and then it accepts what is offered with the same indifference that it shows to everything else that enters its domain. I am merely a witness. But what a witness I have been. The gardens of Bayer still bloom in their underwater twilight, not with the flowers that Roman gardeners cultivated, but with the algae and the anemones and the small creatures that have made this place their home. The mosaics still gleam in the filtered sunlight, their colors still vivid, their patterns still capable of taking the breath away from anyone who descends to see them. The statues still stand, or lie, or lean, their faces still serene, their poses still graceful, their marble still speaking of human ambition and human skill and human vulnerability to forces that do not recognize our importance. And I still remember that first morning, that first descent, that first moment when the green water parted to reveal what lay beneath, and I understood, with a clarity that still makes me catch my breath, that the sea is not our enemy and not our friend, but something far more vast and more patient and more beautiful than any of our categories can contain. A keeper of memories that we did not know we were making, a collector of dreams that we did not know we were dreaming, a witness to our brief, bright lives that will continue witnessing long after the last of us has returned to the water from which we all came.